we have to make an effort to look at diverse pool candidates. The government's not telling us to do that. We were doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Also, just as a point of reference, the word tokenism is popping into mind right now.
I wouldn't even say necessarily tokenism here. I'd say that once again, it's a good example of how American capitalism can tell itself that it can fix these issues by itself. It can't. You can. You're right. If you can't, if you're
totally, but it can start the ball rolling. It has to be a cooperation. My philosophy is that industry by itself can't do it. Otherwise, industry by itself created monopolies and created the gilded age. You have to balance that with regulation. You can't strangle industry. You can't be a socialist country that strangles industry and eliminates. You have to have a cooperation of industry and government.
But what have we seen over the last 20 years?
You have to cooperate.
I don't disagree with you on principle. I mean, I do somewhat disagree. I actually fundamentally disagree with you on principle. I see where you're coming from here. My point to the contrary would be what we have seen from Americans, and what we've seen from America for the last 250 years is a decided disinterest in systemic equations to solve black inequality.
But it's gotten better.
Has it?
Absolutely.
Redlining in Chicago in the 1980s. I mean, it's not like we all of a sudden snapped our fingers and fixed these things. In fact, what we've generally seen is that the piecemeal approach to fixing systemic inequality means nothing ever happens. We were here 4 years ago with Ferguson.
2 o'clock.
Thank you. We'll continue before each class.
Why the air so wet right now?
Oh, because we're about to get hit with a hurricane. Yeah, we're going to get a hurricane in a minute.
I was just staying in Kentucky when there's no doubt tomorrow.
Let me say this, John, with you.
Yes, sir.
You know, as you
I
can
live
probably
in family.
tell.
I'm an oddball. In my family, my wife and my daughter are totally on your side. So
Well,
I'm outnumbered.
You know, I'll say this.
40 seconds. Let's give him 40 seconds.
Let me just say this so that, and I'll even put it on the recording.
Okay.
You know, I obviously try not to inject my politics into what I'm teaching you.
You have.
It will stay away.
You do not.
I don't mind chatting with you before class. I don't mind chatting with you after class. But while I'm in here, my politics stay out of the classroom. And I would appreciate you guys coming at me non-ideologically during class time. John, it's not to point you out, you've been wonderful. Let's always chat about this stuff, but when we're in here, let's stick with the topics, okay?
Totally agree. I think that's fair.
Yes, and I think this is sometimes what happens when you see, you know, conservative discussions of socialist professors and their terrible indoctrination. I don't want to indoctrinate you guys in my beliefs. I want to teach you the history, and that's it.
Last thing, I've been a professor. When I was at WK, when I was living in Bowling, I taught accounting for 2 semesters in the night class. So,
Yeah,
I did the same thing. I didn't try to.
Exactly. As I say at the start of every class to my undergrads, everybody has political issues, and I don't give a shit about yours, and you shouldn't give a shit about mine, because we're not talking about those. If this is a poli-sci class, it'd be a different thing.
Yeah.
But yes, I appreciate a good debate about just about any topic. You know me. Thank you, John.
About your food topics.
That's right. Now, if you really want to get me riled up, let's talk food. Okay. Yes, I mean, and this is one of the things. It'll be interesting to see if I see any of you all next semester when we talk about the second half of this class. It'll be very interesting to see how the modern American military has interacted with a lot of the things we're discussing now. Obviously, one of the things we'll talk about in this class is the segregation of America's military post-revolution. I mean, we're going to talk about how racial issues crop up pretty much again and again in American military history. And obviously, we're going to get kind of that whole Civil War thing in which, you know, slavery is not just the definer, it is the definer that in the end changes just about everything pre-Civil War. So good food for thought, John. Very good food for thought.
Okay.
Where were we? Where did we leave off? Am I recording this? Yes. Okay.
Consensus based.
What was that?
Consensus based.
Consensus based. Okay, so we were still talking about the standing army. We kind of finished up that discussion. Welcome back. We had finished up talking about kind of the standing army. So now let's talk about the way in which the military of the English Civil Wars is kind of grafted on to the colonial experiment. Make sense? Okay, so let's continue then. English military culture meets the New World. As we started last time, as we were talking about, we talked about John Smith, his mercenary roots, fortifications in early American society. One of the pictures that we haven't really addressed too much, and if you're watching at home, it's the big center, or big right center one. with infantry lined up in a line. You'll notice almost immediately kind of the incongruity of what is obviously a form of linear warfare. And we're going to talk about that concept later a lot, because pretty much the entirety of this class is during what we consider the linear period of warfare. Going forward a few weeks, you'll read an entire essay by John Lynn in his book, Combat and Culture, about what it means when I talk about linear warfare. So don't worry too much that I'm going to throw that term around very briefly today. You'll get a very big explainer of it later. What we're talking about here is both the technology and tactics in a new context. That context is obviously what? What are English settlers and civilian or militia seeing as the new enemy? It's no longer the English Civil Wars. They're no longer in England. They're facing who? The natives. And so what we're going to see, we're going to talk about the natives in just a second, is English settlers, English colonists arrive in a world they neither understand nor are particularly well adapted to. And what we see, despite what we've already mentioned in terms of how often and how frequently they are dying of disease, malnutrition, their inability to gain much more than a foothold on the East Coast, English settlers also have to understand they're moving in to a very different military context than the one they left. For the first and most obvious context that's changing, what is the big difference between the English Civil Wars and showing up in the New World in terms of, well, what's the big difference?
The natives didn't line up with fire.
That's part of it, sure. Let's go even more basic than that. Let me just say this.
There's not really any princes or lords. I mean, you have wealthier people, but you don't really have that distinct class of
You're not wrong, but you're going away from what I'm looking for.
Okay.
I'm looking for something super basic,
super basic.
They're not fighting other English.
even more basic.
I'm missing that.
It's like a different terrain.
Bingo, geography.
Geography.
This is the big one. This is, in the end, why Americans will develop a very different set of warfare than the one that was at home back in England.
Oh,
We have left Kansas. We're no longer in Kansas, Toto. That's what I'm trying to say. The rolling fields and open terrain that is cultivated Europe, basically from Spain to Russia, does not exist in the New World.
And all those forests.
It's all forest. And forest does not lend itself to open field warfare. It is going to be a context through the very, very first 120 years or so of this class cannot be divorced from what we're dealing with. Lining up, gathering in musket lines doesn't work. You can't musket line a big old thing of trees. It doesn't work that way. And as you might guess, because of the geography of the territory we're talking about, obviously, those who are already there have adapted to it long before. The Native Americans themselves, all of them, have formed very different cultural attachments to warfare than the Europeans themselves. And so it's very important we understand what that means. So let's jump to the next slide and talk a little bit about who we're talking about here, the natives themselves. So I do not want to bog you down too much in trying, and you guys can see from the top right, in memorizing every different tribe in the New World. It would be very difficult. It would be completely useless in terms of the overall context of the class. But what I want you to see, what you can very clearly see from this map is what?
There's a lot of different ones.
There's a lot of different ones. When the English settlers show up, what they find is a myriad of tribal conflicts and alliances. Suffice to say, they do not enter a virgin world. They enter one that is far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more developed than they expect. Now, the part of this that's important for you to memorize, at least in terms of the overall tribal structures I want you to put in your head, are the two chief ones. At least the two ones that we'll talk about again and again.
The chief what?
The two chief tribes. Algonquin. Oh my God, I'm spelling Algonquin wrong all of a sudden. Where is it? Algonquin. Algonquin, and it's the other big tribal confederacy,
Cherokee?
Iroquois. The Iroquois.
Oh, that's what Cherokee farms out.
I always spell these both wrong, but they're up there somewhere. The Iroquois and the Algonquin. Now, there are a lot of tribes. The Iroquois Confederacy, though, is probably the most important of them. And it's a confederacy, which means what?
There's like a lot of micro tribes.
A lot of micro tribes have banded together into a single one to assert their influence. Why would native tribes band together like that?
Like the colonists?
Protection, not colonial protection. That's a very good point. But in the end, we actually think the Iroquois Confederacy probably forms, lost that one, somewhere between 1450 and 1660. The lack of a precise date there is because there's no written records that indicate when it actually happened. All we can understand of the Iroquois Confederacy's conglomeration is that their relationship is largely built on a shared what? Does anybody know why the Iroquois tribes are so good, why they ally themselves together besides the political reasons? Nope. Language, very good. Language. A similar linguistic structure is what creates some of these confederacies. They find that banding together provides them with protection, not just from the colonists, but who?
Each other.
Each other. The Iroquois find actually that when they start as a confederacy, not only are they strong enough to protect themselves, they're also what?
They're able to conquer.
Strong enough to expand. The Iroquois Confederacy, and we'll talk about it over and over again, will become the dominant native confederacy and will spend a lot of time playing French and English off one another because they're strong enough to do so. Now, what's important about this and why I want to mention the Iroquois is when we talk about French settlement, particularly of Canada, what we have to understand is the Iroquois and the Iroquois Confederacy are here, what is modern upstate New York bordering the St. Lawrence River. They're made up of the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. Eventually, they'll be joined by the Tuscarora in 1721. But what's important about this is that Europeans don't necessarily understand the fact that when they show up in the early 1600s, they are involving themselves with several long-running wars. The most important is the Iroquois Confederacy's expansion across this area over quite a few decades. In doing so, the Iroquois either subjugated tribes, destroyed them, or pushed them west. Though, we have to understand a central context of this, and we'll talk about it in the very next slide, is that the natives conceptualized warfare very differently than the Europeans. Remember, the Europeans had just watched in the mid-1600s what very destructive war? The 30 Years' War. Remember, I want you guys always,
Could you repeat that?
yes, I want you guys to keep this in mind constantly. The 30 Years' War, the destructiveness, the absolute devastation of Germany sits very deeply in the European conscience.
8 million people.
What was that?
8 million people.
Yeah, remember what I said about the Pew Research thing? It doesn't just sit in German conscience. In the end, the 30 Years' War will be a big chunk of why we focus on what we'll eventually call limited warfare in this class, which by itself sounds like an oxymoron, right? Those two things should be antithetical, but we'll talk about them more. The natives themselves, I want you to take a look at some of the other things here, are undergoing a significant societal upheaval. What is the one thing that is causing this upheaval more than anything? It's on the bottom right of the pictures if you're looking at home. Disease. As you might expect, watching between 60 and 90% of your population waste away suddenly and unexpectedly of diseases that you do not understand and cannot control has a completely crippling effect on many of these tribes. Some of the amalgamation isn't just for self-preservation. It's simply because what?
There's no one left.
There's no one left. We really have to understand that as the primary context of the native wars and of the native reaction to the Europeans. We just can't, it's really hard for us to encapsulate, or at least understand in our brains, what it means to watch 60 to 90% of your community die hideously. without explanation. Remember, these tribes do not have immunities to European diseases. More often than not, they do not understand what's happening. Even the Europeans themselves are not entirely sure what's happening. But as you might expect, watching a huge chunk of your population die does what to your culture? It destroys it. I mean, if it doesn't completely and utterly end the tribe, it certainly impacts the survivors, does it not? Now, this is where we really are going to have to understand a very important concept. A concept that is almost entirely alien to the way in which we understand warfare today. And so there it's very important. Let's talk about what are called the Mourning Wars. I don't mean mourning as in mourning of the dead. I mean what? What was that?
Mourning of the dead.
Yes, Mourning Wars. This is the style of warfare practiced by the natives, and it is completely different than what we've probably heard of before. Pretty much all of the native tribes, whether they're Algonquin, Iroquois, Creek, Choctaw, you name it, any of them practice mourning wars. What do you think a mourning war is in this context then? Somebody want to take a shot?
Killing everybody.
No? What is it? What do you think a mourning war means? This is a real, so I'm glad we haven't heard of this. This is a hard one, and it's so alien to what we understand as warfare. Today, if the U.S. went to war with, pick a country. Canada. Okay, pick a different country. Iran. If the U.S. went to war with Iran, how would we fight that war? Send in the troops, send in the what? Tanks, bombs. We're going to do what until Iran surrenders? Blow their shit up until it's over, right? That's modern total war.
Destroy them.
You attack everything. You attack their infrastructure. You attack their society. In World War II, did we stop once we had broken Hitler's armies, or did we bomb the shit out of Germany's civilian population? What do we call that? What's the top right? That's total war. When you mobilize the society to destroy your enemy's society, every bit of it, that's total war. Mourning war, then, is almost the direct opposite. Mourning wars are what we might call small wars, i.e., they are generally far less destructive. Never were any other native tribes generally attempting to destroy other tribes. Generally, mourning wars had two primary goals. One was what? Well, let me just say it. I should probably explain. One is plunder. Native warriors themselves, and we'll talk about the way in which they fought later, generally fought these wars because that was part of what we would consider their warrior society. In the same way that knights in Europe proved their prowess on the battlefield, so did natives. These wars were extremely cyclical. Every summer, once the harvest and the hunting season was over, warriors traveled to fight other tribes. It was as part and parcel of life as almost anything else. What that meant, though, and as you might expect with much smaller native populations, these wars were not fought to the knife. Women and children were not killed as part and parcel of warfare. Instead, the primary motive outside of plunder and therefore prestige, as these things went hand in hand, was what? And this one's very important. This is what mourning wars were. The other goal was captives. Now, not ransom. Quite different, in fact. Instead, captives brought back during these mourning wars were not killed generally. They weren't mutilated.
Integrated?
They were integrated. They were made part of the tribe. In fact, these mourning wars were an effort to replace who? Replace the dead. Very good.
Wow.
Very different.
And those people would just submit to that?
Generally, yes.
So
Now, there certainly were those who were killed or those who resisted. or those who for some reason never made it back to their original tribe. But the vast majority were simply amalgamated into their new tribe.
So to replace the people dying.
To replace the people who may have died in the last war, who may have died of disease, who may have died of starvation,
To
who may
keep
have
up, to keep up and take the pressure off birth rate.
Let me say it this way. Say I'm a native Algonquin warrior, and during the last winter season, my son died of starvation. I'm going out during the next Mourning War, and I'm going to find what?
You are not my son.
I'm going to find a new son.
Wow.
It's a very different system than what we.
So,
If we went to Iran in the same context we talked about earlier, is that something you'd see American soldiers doing?
No.
No, of course not. It's completely alien to us,
That's
right?
Totally foreign.
Completely foreign to us.
This was going on even before the Europeans.
Even before the Europeans showed up. This was the main context, because again, it's a completely different society that produces a completely different form of warfare.
so if the natives were to view our total warfare, they would call us the savages, pretty much, because we're attacking everything in sight.
We're going to talk about this
Yeah.
right now, very soon, because again, remember, if culture produces warfare and two different cultures that do not understand each other are suddenly fighting one another, what does that generally mean for how that war is going to go?
It's going to get really bad.
It's going to get really bad. They don't understand each other. In fact, one of the most famous, let me see if I can find a picture. I have a picture of it here. Yes, I do. I don't know if you guys can see this one. If you're at home, go back to the military roots of English colonization. Do you see this picture? Do you see anything about it? This is a very old woodcut of I think the Battle of Mystic River.
There's one dude.
Do you see the Europeans?
Not very many.
Okay, so you see there's a couple Europeans and two native tribes fighting one another. This actually comes from a French woodcut of a battle they witnessed. The French didn't understand what was happening. The natives would fire a few arrows, then back off. Fire a few arrows, then back off. Very few casualties, very few deaths. In a lot of ways, it was much closer to what?
A game?
A game.
I was thinking it.
I don't want you guys to walk away from this thinking native warfare was all like, what to do, no big deal.
It's like the
It just wasn't nearly as bloody, or at least it wasn't nearly as total as the European expression of war. And so, what you get again, and these French observers would remark on it over and over, and as they talk through their interpreters to the native tribes, why aren't you killing all of them? Why aren't you burning their settlement? Why aren't you sowing their fields with salt? Why are you guys taking the kids home? Why are you taking the adults home? What are you doing? Two different groups. No cultural reference points, right?
Treated more like competition.
It's more like a competition than it is a war. Because to them, watching the sudden disappearance of plenty of tribes to disease, as well as having a long understanding of how these tribes worked with one another, often because they shared linguistic capability, or excuse me, linguistic, what's the word I'm looking for? Similarities. Often because they came from similar cultural roots, these wars weren't nearly as destructive as the European understanding of war. And remember, we're coming out of this context, where Europe didn't just play around at war, it did what? It was total war. The Europeans were coming out of a period of some of the most destructive and hideous religious wars they would fight until the 20th century. The natives, on the opposite hand, were coming at it in a very different context. And so, to understand Mourning Wars, we have to understand that the natives themselves often fought for such fundamentally different reasons that the Europeans often misinterpreted it. And as you might expect, once the Europeans and the natives started fighting one another, did that mean the natives suddenly abandoned the way in which they fought?
Nah.
What is this picture?
It's like taking a European girl home.
Taking a European child home. Plenty of European children were not only adopted by native cultures, but often were one-to-one replacements for native dead.
Yes, forced immigration, right?
You could look at it that way. It's better to look at it as the natives simply adopted the Europeans to what?
Their culture.
Their culture. They simply added them to the extensive webs that you can see here. Is it?
Wow,
Yeah,
this,
because like all they wanted to do was just incorporate them into their society, and the Europeans were like, kill.
As we'll see, the Europeans conceptualized war so differently that once the two ran into each other, what was the natural outcome?
death.
Why? Well, beyond death, obviously people are going to die in these.
Well, yeah, because the Europeans,
are gonna win.
The Europeans are not just going to win, they're going to do what?
they're gonna just.
They're going to fight to the end, while the native societies are by their predicate disposition more likely to not do that, right?
Oh, yeah.
If the natives don't have a system in which their ultimate goal is to burn your fields, massacre your people, and end your entire society, is it ever going to be a fundamentally equal form of warfare? No. Europeans fight to the death. The natives are fighting a completely different system.
They call us the savages, man.
Why, it just amazes me at my age, never having heard this. I didn't hear it in high school, I didn't hear it in my undergraduate history years ago. I haven't read it, anything I've ever read. It's just amazing.
It seems like they want to sweep it under the rug. but-
Yeah, this is unusual to me.
There's two reasons. One, what is almost always ignored in your all's textbooks growing up?
That could mean a lot of things.
That's a good point. Let me just say this. When's the last time you remembered an in-depth discussion of warfare in any of your classes in high school or middle school?
No.
Almost never. They're generally, wars themselves generally are just skipped right over. Like, we got to the start of the Civil War, peace, it's the Gilded Age. That's a problem, obviously, in American teaching. The obvious second one is, what does this almost certainly mean about how the Americans, how the Europeans interacted with these native tribes? Was it ever going to end up as anything besides genocide?
No.
We have to be very clear.
It was preordained.
It was, and that's a good point, because what that does is it often excuses European behavior by saying, well, we're going to do it anyways.
Exactly.
But what it meant was these two societies weren't fighting the same war. One was fighting to replace its population losses, to replace its social and cultural losses. The other one is doing it to
Destroy the enemy.
the land, the enemy, all of it. Because that's the context the Europeans knew back home.
But didn't they learn to adapt to that style of warfare?
The natives,
Yeah.
we'll see the natives never adapt to it. And this is part of the problem.
They started winning battles.
Here's the thing, yes. So they're going to win battles, but what we're going to generally see of the natives is it's harder for the natives to sustain confederacies as long and as far as the Europeans do. Their lack of an ability to rely on their own technology, i.e. generally what happens when the natives fight Europeans, especially after they've gotten used to European guns as part of their culture, which they adapt very quickly. In fact, many of the natives find they're much better shots than the Europeans almost immediately. It's hard for the natives to sustain wars for the length of time necessary. And then what's the one big advantage the Europeans will consistently have over the natives that make it almost impossible for them not to win? Demographics. Bingo. Now, John mentioned an important person. We'll see this. In the next war we look at, King Philip's War, something in the neighborhood of 1 out of every 8 or out of every 9 Europeans in the King Philip's War died of the entire colony. And they still roll over the natives relatively easily. John has hit on a very important point. And this is one of the real reasons that the Europeans win. Who'd you mention?
Tecumseh.
We're going to come back to Tecumseh. Tecumseh might have been, for general reference, Tecumseh was what tribe was Tecumseh?
I'm not sure.
Oh, man. Shawnee, no, not Shawnee. Tecumseh lived in what is now modern Ohio, in the Great Lakes region. He was a great war leader. In fact, probably one of the most brilliant Americans ever. And let's make it clear. He lived in America. He was a native to it. He was an American. He was a native soldier, a native warrior, part of the warrior society. He saw very fundamentally that the one unavoidable context of European expansion was what? What did he notice for the native tribes? If they didn't unite, they would what? They would be wiped out. And so Tecumseh spent much of his life, along with his brother, the prophet, Tenskwatawa, who we'll talk about later, attempting to build coalition after coalition, always based on the idea that what needed to happen?
Survival.
all natives needed to unite, no matter what tribe or culture they were in, and do what? Not just fight back like the Europeans. No more confederations that pop up and then disappear. No more wars that last one season. The problem was the separate native cultures simply could not band together in the same way or sustain these campaigns for a long time. Even with someone like Tecumseh, who was far-sighted enough to see that the end of this story was what? The eventual elimination of Native Americans as a political and military group. Does that happen? Yeah, by 1890, is there a single native tribe that isn't on some sort of reservation? Not a single one. The eventual answer that even Tecumseh saw back in 1810 was that there was no winning without uniting and throwing back white settlers. But in the end, white settlers had an overwhelming advantage. Not only was it written into the demographics as they arrived in increasing numbers, a high birth rate, an ability to avoid the European diseases that were ravaging native populations, and more to the point, a different style of warfare that allowed them to fight to the knife, is a better way to think about it. Two different forms of warfare, two different societies produced by two different cultures. So antithetical to one another that in the end, once those two came in contact, was it preordained? It's hard not to argue, looking back, that it was almost unavoidable. The mixture of demographics, germs, and style of warfare meant that if America ever, or the United States or the Europeans, if they continued to be interested in pushing west, it meant what for the natives who were out there? Eventual destruction. As long as the American system was predicated on westward movement, as we'll talk about in this class, which it was, it's hard not to argue with the conception that natives were doomed almost from the very get-go. It's something we need to wrap our heads around, for the simple fact that Mourning Wars are almost always written out of textbooks, because they show the natives themselves weren't fighting the war they're often portrayed as fighting. Did they burn farmsteads? Did they kill women and children? Absolutely. Let's not pretend that the natives were some sort of put-upon group. They fought back, brutally, in fact. They recognized their destruction was at hand many times. But the Europeans, for a variety of reasons, won. Something we have to grapple with, because in the end, just because it's originally English colonists who land in the 1650s, what nation finishes it? What nation finishes it with Gatling guns at Wounded Knee in 1890? Ours does. And if we don't grapple with that fact, that just because it started before we existed does not mean we didn't finish it. After all, the ghost dance movement of the 1890s, does anybody remember what the ghost dance movement was about?
Yeah. I remember some from like Acreage, they were doing like a tribal dance for like healing or something, but somebody oversaw it and thought that they were preparing for war, and so.
The ghost dance movement, before we even get to the fact the federal government eventually stamps it out, on the reservations, the last of the reservations, the ghost dance movement was yet another collection of prophets, not unlike Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, who said that they needed to get rid of the Europeans, white settlers, and things would go back to normal. Unlike Tecumseh, who in the 1810s could lead a military confederation, by 1890 military resistance was over. And so their movement was inherently a religious movement. It believed that if they did the ghost dances themselves, the bison would come back, the white men would be swallowed by the earth, the ancestors who had died of disease and massacre over the last 300 years would return to the earth, and the natives would re-inherit the territory that was taken from them. It's a religious movement based entirely on what? The complete opposite. Desperation. There's no hope left by the 1890s. The real question is, when did that hope truly die? It's a hard thing to reckon with, yes?
Yeah.
It's a very hard thing to reckon with, because once we study it from the military side, we see that the fissures in Native society meant that it was very hard, no matter how much they recognized the existential threat, to fight back. Then, and we're going to talk about it very soon, you mix in the colonists' insatiable need for land, as well as the colonists' ability to both align with and manipulate tribes to their own ends. And let's be clear, the natives are doing it to the Europeans as well. There's a lot of give and take in this relationship. That it's very hard for the natives not to have to only fight Europeans, but also have to fight who? Other tribes. In the end, when we talk about the French and Indian War, the French and the Indians are obviously on one side against the English, but so are the English and Indians, so are the Algonquins and the Iroquois, so are the Wyandot and the Huron. Such complexity, especially within native tribes, meant that it was extremely hard for them to come up with confederations that could have ever driven back any sense of this demographic push. Make sense? Okay. So let's then talk a little bit about the European conception and understanding of mourning wars. To them, what did mourning wars probably look like? You mentioned it earlier, actually. Games, sport. More than one European observer would reckon it with a sport or a game. They didn't quite understand the nature of the warfare that was often fire a bow, disappear into the woods. As you guys can see from the last slide, the Europeans lined up in lines in linear warfare. Not only was the entire cultural predilection of fighting different, but so was the tactics, and so was the technology. This is going to be part of it as well. Let's stick here for just a second. As you guys can see, the very first attempt by the English to adapt their style of warfare to the New World was obviously what? What is it? Does this look like it's particularly useful in the fighting in backwoods? Heavy armor, pikes, line shot? No. Europeans will learn relatively quickly that they have to adapt to the natives just as much as the natives will eventually adapt to them. Generally, what we might call this trade-off is the natives adopt one thing in particular from the Europeans, and that's what? Take a wild guess at what the natives look at the natives look at the Europeans and say, what would I like about their military culture? Their guns. Absolutely. Absolutely. The natives will find, like I just mentioned, the natives are often even more proficient in guns than the Europeans who arrived with them. Part of that is a culture that was essentially a hunter-gatherer society. Even though there was certain cultivation across the eastern seaboard, plenty of cultivation across the north, many of these tribal societies were hunter tribes first and foremost. Men hunted, women gathered, women also took care of the home, they fished. These were essentially societies that were never terribly far from the brink of what? More particular in terms of food, starvation. Part of the issue here is unlike the European grain silos back home, these societies could not go 2 or 3 years of sustained campaigning without having to send their warriors home to do what? Eat, hunt, more particularly to store up enough food for the winter. Ergo, sustained campaigning on the scale that the Europeans were used to year after year for 30 years were simply impossible. The lack of large-scale agriculture, though there was certainly agriculture, it was never on the size of the Europeans, meant Europe meant the Europeans were almost always going to have an advantage in what? Numbers. Remember, the more you farm, the bigger your society gets. Why? Yeah, it's more stable. It goes all the way back to the very Neolithic Revolution. The second you cultivate more land, you cultivate more food, you're able to store more food, ergo, more people can be released to do non-food related tasks. Exactly, division of labor. It goes all the way back to the underpinnings of civilization. These civilizations, these native civilizations, never have the same huge demographic numbers because they simply are not farming societies, unlike the Europeans who are arriving. Remember, the Europeans are arriving because there's an abundance of what? Land, which they are turning into cultivated land.
What causes the wars, right?
See how this all feeds into one another?
Isn't that what caused St. Philip's War? Was the-
Yes, King Philip's War in the end. We'll talk about King Philip's War in just a second, because it's kind of what starts it. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about King Philip's War. It's a good time for it. King Philip's War is our first good example war of what's going on. King Philip is not a real person, or at least that's not his name.
Indian, right?
Yes, his name is Metacum.
Like a walker or something. What's the term?
Oh, these are Narragansett Indians. Metacum, or King Philip, as he was called by the English, was a leader of a major confederation, a major native confederacy in what is modern-day Connecticut. By this point in the 1600s, by the late 1670s, mid-1670s, the population of Connecticut and the New England colonies is probably not much more 10 to 12,000 Europeans. A sizable number, though. And King Philip's War actually comes about because the Connecticut authorities and the New England authorities were actually allied with the native tribes around them. And like I've said before, this is a very complex web. Just because we know that the final story is white versus native, and it's a destruction of the native, does not mean there were plenty of periods where there wasn't peace, trade, and tranquility. After all, King Philip's War is born of the breakdown of alliances between the Narragansetts and the European settlers. In the end, what actually happens is the execution of several natives for cattle thieving. It pisses off the native tribes, who in the end retaliate. And the way in which retaliation meant for the natives was what? What was if you think that Mourning Wars, what do you think Mourning Wars look like in reality? What would we compare them to?
Like writing?
Bingo, very good, John, exactly the word I'm looking for. Raids. Generally, in a style of warfare like small warfare, what we're talking about here is attacking isolated frontier towns, burning individual cabins, the capture of what? Captives to replenish the tribes over and over again. And so the natives, hard to say they started this war, but they start a war based on the style of warfare they've been fighting for, I don't know, their entire existence as a people. Now, in doing so, they're, at least initially, very successful. King Philip's War goes pretty well for them for some time. Probably the closest a European colony ever comes in the original 13 colonies to actually being destroyed. Something in the neighborhood of 1 out of 8 men of military age, white men of military age, die in this war. A very high number. About something in the neighborhood of half the towns in the colony are either burned or evacuated. Because this is something we're going to see kind of again and again. And so I kind of want to hit on this really briefly while I'm thinking about it. Because this will kind of be a central point to how we understand colonization. Think of this as the world's worst drawing of the Eastern Seaboard. This is, I want to hear you, I want to see you nodding. You've seen my other maps, they're all just atrocious. Say this is our star fort at which the first settlement happens. And so keep this in mind, particularly in the case of, let's pretend it's Providence, or one of the big towns settled in Connecticut, Providence being the lead capital at that point. If this is the town that has been settled 20, 30 years before, where are all the farms that are sustaining this town?
On the outside.
Very good. Eventually, will these farms be enough to sustain the population? No. In fact, not just sustain the population, but who do we need to be giving new land to as part of their indenture contracts? The indentured servants play a part in this. They've worked for 7 years on the farms of the people who paid their indenture contract. 7 years are up, which means it's time for them to get what? Land. Are they going to get land subdivided off their indenture contract? Nope. It's going to be somewhere else. What do we call this area? What is this area always called until it no longer exists?
The frontier.
Bingo! The frontier. The mystique of the frontier will stick with us through the entirety of American history until the West is closed in 1890. The frontier was obviously not an actual place. It's a constantly moving zone in which there is comparatively little civilization and far less protection. And so, for this continually to happen, the next generation moves out. They build their farms on the outskirts. As you might guess, as they build their farms, what are they likely to build somewhere on the frontier to assist them? Another fort. This is how forts are generally built in the backcountry. They're not built because they actually offer a terrible amount of protection when the raid starts. What are they really? When the raiding starts or a war starts, what happens to the backcountry?
Evacuate.
It evacuates. They evacuate to these forts. Simply as the frontier goes, so do the forts, so do the farms. 7 years pass. What happens again? The frontier moves again. This constant cycle, as you can see, leads to an expansion of arable land farmed by European settlers, a constantly expanding zone. Now, one of the reasons this is so important to mention is this land doesn't generally belong to the Europeans, right? More often than not, it is purchased from the natives. There are plenty of times we'll talk in this class where that purchase is either fraudulent, it's predicated on a bad land deed, or simply there was no deed, they just went ahead and moved in. One of the most consistent ways the Virginians did it, anybody know how the Virginians were very fond of grabbing new land? They let their pigs and other cattle, or their other pigs and other domestic animals roam into native areas where they would eat corn and other native food. The natives would do what? Kill the pigs, cattle, etc. The Europeans would then demand what in return? Compensation, which would either be land, and if the natives rightly said, go fuck yourself, what happened? Let's just do it anyways. This is kind of the cyclical nature of the need to constantly expand. What's that?
That's a clever strategy, actually. Pinning the blame on the enemy instead of.
You know, we could say it's clever, but it's also more than anything what? It's almost accidental, isn't it?
Oh, okay.
I mean, letting out your animals to roam, somewhat part of simple farming at the time. You don't have the ability to farm or fence in all this land. The native culture itself, once they notice these things are happening, are likely to retaliate, which then gives the Europeans, if they so choose, an excuse. It's hard to say accidental. Accidental is the wrong word, but it's an accidentally on purpose kind of deal. At least several of the Virginian wars, particularly the Pequot War, the Pequot War, I'm losing it. One of the Tidewater Wars is certainly entirely based on the fact that somebody's pig wandered too far into land it didn't belong in. Such is the point. To continue with Phillip's War, we'll finish with King Philip's War today. In the end, we get to this battle. Battle in which the natives have banded together, built a fort, and try to prevent the Europeans from further breaking into their territory. As you might expect, what does that generally mean for the New England militia that assembles? What does it give them? It gives them a specific target. One of the problems with fighting raiders is that what usually happens when you're trying to chase them? They just melt. The Europeans, and we'll see this kind of again and again, usually when you hear that the frontier is burning, it's not like you're going to catch the natives doing it. You're going to show up 3, 4, 5, 6 days later to what? A burned cabin and dead bodies. So, in centralizing themselves in trying to fight from a prepared position, what have the natives done? They've played right into the European hands. Siege and a formal fist fight are what the Europeans are ready for. And big shocker, what happens? Complete massacre. The end of King Philip's War happens when something in the neighborhood of 2,000 native warriors die, and we usually count another 3,000 to 4,000. Here's the real difference: civilians. Europeans, the English in this case, take out what they see as the native culture supplying these warriors. This will be something we see again and again. The Europeans understand fundamentally, if they want to cut off the warrior's ability to continue to raid, who's the easiest group to kill? Women and children. the groups that are most likely to be planting, the groups that are most likely to be at home and fishing, groups they can find and identify. It's hard to catch raiders when they don't want to be caught, particularly in a wooded, hilly, and easily disappearable terrain. The Europeans simply are not equipped to fight in. But the centralization here, the combination of fighting in a prepared spot, means the Europeans have the ability not only to zero in on the warriors themselves, more to the point, it gives them the ability to zero in on the women and children. And then they're back on what?
Total war.
Familiar ground. Total war.
So what was the battle where they built a
Oh,
fort?
I'm spacing one, otherwise I've mentioned it. I'm trying to remember the damn name of this battle. Great Swamp. Great
What
Swamp.
would be the most significant difference between limited war and Mourning War? Just the way it's conducted?
Great Swamp is the answer. This is the battle we're talking about. Great Swamp. What's that?
What would be the most significant difference between limited war and Mourning War? Just like the way it's conducted?
So we're going to talk about definitions of limited war.
Scope?
Scope is one of them. More to the point, it's kind of the idea behind it. One of the things we're going to talk about
Like the
as,
purpose?
so basically, I think it's maybe the next slide in fact. No, okay. So a couple slides from now, we're going to talk about why Europeans decide it's a good idea back in Europe to begin to explore the idea of limited war. Remember, they're as revolted at their own behavior as we are. They look at the 30 Years' War and say, shit, that kind of got out of hand. And so many Europeans, especially at the upper levels, military theorists, politicians decide, I don't have any problem fighting you. Let's have a war. I'm all down for it. But who should we probably leave alone while we do it? Civilians. This is where we actually get what we call the Age of Enlightenment's warfare system. Limited war is inherently about protecting civilian populations from the excesses of the 30 Years' War and the wars of religion. It doesn't also hurt that we move away from the wars of religion and move to what we call the cabinet wars, in which it's mostly kings and princes fighting it out with armies made up of conscripts. That means that their objectives are inherently more limited. Here, is there any limit to the objectives? The land is infinite. The land is occupied by a group you don't understand and certainly don't respect. And so in the end, the warfare never remains limited here because the objectives are never limited. It's quite literally from sea to shining sea is the option. Does America or the English eventually deal with that?
Yeah.
Sea to shining sea is in our what is it in song?
Manifest Destiny or something?
We'll talk about Manifest Destiny for
God,
sure.
What is it? God bless America.
God bless America. We say from sea to shining sea. From the very get-go, we understand that the possibilities of colonization and growth are nearly limitless. Do you want to have a limited war when the possibilities are limitless? No, not at all. I think it's a great, oh, go ahead.
So Mourning War would literally just be a limited war with a specified objective.
With a very small objective. That objective was generally tribal replenishment, not trying to destroy the tribes around it. After all, just take a look at this map. This is a war of pushing, not a war of destruction. Most of these tribes survive in the long run, even if they're amalgamated elsewhere. You don't generally see when the French destroy, when they're fighting the Spanish, that they try to amalgamate a chunk of the population back home. It just doesn't work that way. Make sense? Alrighty, I think it's a good stopping spot.
See, senor.
Have a wonderful weekend.
But yeah, honestly,